Good evening to everybody, and a very warm welcome to St John's College and to this year's Sidney Ball Memorial Lecture. I'm Sue Black, and I have the honour and the privilege of being the 37th president of this college. So we are very proud to be associated with this lecture, as Sidney Ball was a prominent figure at St John's in modern history as a socialist thinker and as an educational reformer. Born in Pershore in Worcestershire in 1857, he graduated from Oriel College reading classics, and he joined St John's as a fellow in philosophy in 1882, and 3 years later he became our senior tutor. I am reliably informed that he also applied to be the president in 1909, but he was deemed to be too progressive for the role. I'm not quite sure what that means nowadays. In 1883, he was one of the founders of Toynbee Hall, and in 1895, he became a founding member of the Oxford University Fabian Society, an offshoot from the Fabian Society, which is Britain's oldest political think tank. In 1916, he became an architect of the D.Phil degree, and his thinking was influential in the introduction of the PPE degree. He campaigned for the admission of women to full membership of the university and the abolishment of compulsory chapel. When Ball died in 1918, the Barnet House Committee renamed their annual lecture in his honour, as he was their first chairman. The event brings distinguished speakers to Oxford each autumn to discuss key themes in social policy and intervention. Ball strongly believed that places of learning should be open to all, and I do hope that he would approve of the modern St. John's, with its focus firmly set on quality, equality, diversity, and wider access opportunities. So it is a very warm welcome to St. John's, and it's my pleasure now to hand over to Professor Kenneth Nelson, who is going to introduce this evening's speaker. Kenneth.
So thank you, and I wish you all a very warm welcome to the 119th Sidney Ball Memorial Lecture. So I'm Kenneth Nelson. I'm a Barnet Professor in Social Policy and head of the Department of Social Policy and Intervention. So it's a very great pleasure for us at DSPI to be here, be part of organizing this lecture again. So I would like to start to express our deep gratitude to Professor Lady Sue Black and Baroness Black of Strome and St. John's College for hosting us at this lovely lecture hall, and of course for the food and the drinks that we will get after. I also would like to thank Amanda and Gulsha at DSPI for helping us to organize this event, and for our dedicated communications team, and particularly Rachel for all the hard work of promoting this event. So before I introduce today's speaker, I want to say something briefly about the lecture series, as well as something about DSPI. So the first lecture in this series was given over 100 years ago in 1917, just a few years after the Barnet House was established in 1914. So at the time, the Barnet House was set up as a center of excellence for the study of contemporary social and economic problems, and for training young people in social work and research. So over the years, the Sidney Ball Memorial Lecture have hosted some very prominent scholars and luminaries. Among the very early speakers, we had John Keynes, Sidney Webb, Richard Tawney, Sir William Beveridge, and Richard Titmuss, and others. So DSPI originated from the Barnet House, which was formally incorporated into the University of Oxford in 1961. So at DSPI, we not only continue the tradition of the Barnet House in improving our understanding of various social problems that we observe in the United Kingdom, Europe, and in the world, but we are also interested in finding evidence-based ways to solve them. We very much believe that the research we do at DSPI and the teaching that we provide continue to make a significant difference in the world. So it is therefore a great pleasure to welcome our speaker today, Professor Vandenbroucke, who have changed, I would say, the lives of millions of Europeans, not least in his work on providing a much stronger legal basis for welfare policies in the EU. Frank is not only a true scholar, but he has also a long and successful political career, and he is currently the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Health and Social Affairs of Belgium. So thanks to one of our DSPI associate members, Elisabeth Peretz, and our former head of department, George Smith, it came to my knowledge that the Barnett House actually has a very special relationship to Belgium. Elisabeth and George, I guess you're here. Could you raise your arms? Okay. Okay, but Elisabeth is here, so it's really good to have you here, Elisabeth. So Elisabeth and George, they kindly told me that the Barnett House played a key role in welcoming academics and other members of the Belgian refugee community during the First World War. So the Barnett House ran a reception center in their building on the corner of Turl Street and Broad Street, basically where the art bookshop of the Blackwells now stands. So also from this perspective, it's a perfect match to have Frank here today. Frank is not only an academic and politician, he is also a prominent Oxford University alumni. He earned his PhD from the Faculty of Social Studies at Oxford University, and between 2001 and 2009, he was a visiting fellow at Nuffield College. So again, Frank, thank you very much for joining us today, and we are very much looking forward to your lecture on how we can defend the welfare state in hard times, a very important topic. So welcome up.
Dear President, dear Kenneth, fellow students, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor to be invited for the Sidney Ball Memorial Lecture. And your invitation also triggered me to revisit some of the ideas I've been working on indeed in Oxford 30 years ago, ideas on justice and social solidarity. And I think for a start, one thing is clear today. If we want our European welfare states to survive and flourish, if we want our democracies in Europe to survive and flourish, we need more solidarity. External pressure, like Russia's aggression and the breakdown of the multilateral order, as well as internal pressure from an aging population, rising care needs, all demand greater solidarity. Fortunately, we've witnessed recently solidarity in action, and I think we've seen its benefits. During the COVID-19 pandemic, collective action, civic solidarity and professional solidarity were crucial at both national and EU levels. It is impossible to think consistently about solidarity without thinking consistently about personal responsibility. That is the thesis I've always defended, and which I will revisit here. But I want to reflect on what exact conception of responsibility best fits contemporary welfare states. To be practical, my lecture is based on the longer and a more elaborate background paper available on my website. I'll show you the QR code at the end. The paper is work in progress, and I would very much like to receive your critical comments or questions tonight orally, but also by mail. So I would like to invite you to do a little bit of co-creation around this. Since the early 1980s, when I began my career, we witnessed a very long cycle, I think, in the dominant conception of the benefits and the problems of welfare state solidarity. Over time, the emphasis shifted from recognizing the societal benefits of solidarity to worrying about the problem of moral hazards the problem of reduced personal responsibility. Now, in the wake of COVID-19, it seemed that the pendulum was swinging back. Less focus on moral hazard, more appreciation of the benefits of solidarity. And indeed, as I said, the pandemic underscored the importance of collective action. However, this trend, I think a hopeful trend, appears to have been interrupted. The European Union is now giving priority to industrial competitiveness and defense spending over public health. And many national governments are tightening budgets and retrenching welfare programs. And we see a renewed, one-sided focus on moral hazard and rather punitive conditions on social benefits. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting we should revive some mythical era of unconditional solidarity. Rather, we must revisit the demands of solidarity and tailor them to the challenges of our time. Let me first explain how I propose to define and understand welfare state solidarity. Welfare states provide income security, relieve poverty, organize care, invest in people's capabilities through social benefits, taxation, public services like healthcare, childcare, education. And solidarity is at work in all these areas. We pool resources to help those facing misfortune or disadvantage. And I agree with the political philosopher Philippe van Parijs that a defining feature of this institutionalized solidarity, the reason why we call it solidarity, is a symmetry. It is a symmetry best captured by the expression mutual responsibility. Solidarity means that we take responsibility for each other as members of some more or less imagined community. Van Parijs traces that definition back to Léon Bourgeois, a French thinker, Prime Minister, Nobel Peace Prize winner, who published his famous book on La Solidarité. Now, we should also be clear about what we mean by responsibility. By the end of this lecture, you will see that the expression responsibility returns in 4 different connotations. The common denominator, the most generic understanding of what responsibility is about, is that it refers to a legitimate expectation. We hold Peter responsible for something, say an outcome or readiness to act in a certain way or a certain type of behavior, if there is a legitimate expectation vis-à-vis Peter with regard to that outcome or readiness to act or behavior. Now, welfare solidarity inherently involves responsibility in 2 key ways. First, by definition, it entails a mutual duty. I'm expected to help you when you encounter bad luck, and you are expected to do the same for me. That responsibility as duty is, say, the moral core of solidarity. But second, welfare solidarity usually comes with responsibility as accountability. We expect a certain behavior from people who benefit from it. Our aid can come with conditions. For instance, someone receiving unemployment benefits should make a genuine effort to find work. And that expectation is justified by a concern for moral hazard. That is our perfectly rational propensity to become less prudent, take more risk, because we are to some extent protected against it. Mitigating moral hazard is a pragmatic necessity if solidarity is institutionalized. If that institutional solidarity is to be maintained, therefore kept within certain limits. But on a more fundamental level, there might be an argument of justice about moral hazard, depending on our conception of justice. If an individual's hardship clearly results from their own choices, many would argue it's not society's duty to subsidize that choice. That is the intuition behind so-called luck egalitarian theories of justice. Luck egalitarians, people like Ronald Dworkin or Jerry Cohen, claim that solidarity should compensate people for bad luck or brute bad luck, not for the reasonably foreseeable consequences of deliberate choices. A luck egalitarian, for example, would insist that unemployment benefits be conditional on job search efforts, not only to reduce moral hazards for pragmatic reasons, but as a matter of justice. Without any job search, the unemployment can be considered as voluntary rather than a misfortune for which solidarity is due. There's a very famous quote by Cohen from 1989 when he made a remark on Ronald Dworkin, who initiated this luck egalitarian, and Cohen wrote, "Dworkin has in effect performed for egalitarianism the considerable service of incorporating within it the most powerful idea in the arsenal of the anti-egalitarian right, the idea of choice and responsibility." End of quote of Cohen. But indeed, by qualifying the demands of just equality in this way, luck egalitarianism is able to escape a kind of familiar anti-egalitarian criticism, like the claim that it panders to the undeserving poor at the expense of hardworking citizens. I'm quoting a paper by Serena Olsaretti. Now, should we apply a luck egalitarian perspective to solidarity? Question mark. That question has exercised me for 30 years, since I had the privilege of working in the mid-90s, as Professor Nelson said, on a doctorate supervised by Jerry Cohen, who played a key role in the further development of luck egalitarianism, and also by Tony Atkinson, a former warden of Nuffield College, whose work on inequality still inspires us today. And it was a real honor to work with these two people. But the question of responsibility exercised me when I introduced for the first time a comprehensive scheme to activate the unemployed in Belgium in 2003. It exercises me again today in view of the massive and growing caseload of people living on incapacity benefits, for whom I want to implement a thorough reform of that system. Before returning to that a bit soul-searching question, I should mention another point. Welfare state solidarity is not purely altruistic. There is enlightened self-interest at play. In practical terms, welfare state solidarity typically combines elements of insurance and redistribution, and social insurance programs pool risks across the population so that everyone contributes and anyone might benefit. In contrast, redistribution, asking the fortunate to support the less fortunate, may not seem to serve one's own interest at first glance. However, economic theory has shown already a long time ago that without some degree of redistribution, adequate insurance for many risks would simply not be feasible. And when a society faces a shock or recession, both insurance and redistribution act as economic stabilizers. In short, solidarity-driven policies not only promote social justice, they also create a more stable, resilient society that benefits everyone. Again, Philippe van Parijs captures, I think, well how solidarity differs from a simple insurance bargain. And he contrasts the motives in this way. The insurance motive says, I help you because I might one day be in your position. It's a kind of probabilistic reciprocity. The solidarity motive says, I help you because I assume I could have been you. Even I know that I shall never be in the sort of trouble in which you are now. That's a counterfactual reciprocity. And it's because of the counterfactual nature of this assumption that solidarity is not purely selfish, like insurance. Yet, an established practice of solidarity still provides each of us with a reduction of our individual vulnerability. We can trust that others will help if we fall into trouble, and they trust that we will do the same. And that is beneficial. Nevertheless, defending the benefits of solidarity has been an uphill battle during much of my professional career, notably in the 1980s. The 1980s indeed marked the heyday of the neoliberal critique of the welfare state. According to neoliberalism, welfare state solidarity set wrong incentives, was rife with moral hazard, and hence a cost factor that created a drag on economic performance. By the mid-1990s, neoliberalism was losing momentum, and a reappraisal of the merits of well-organized welfare states emerged. However, in that reappraisal, much less emphasis was placed on the merits of insurance and redistribution of cash income. The insurance paradigm associated with what we then started to coin as old social risks. The insurance paradigm was seen as something of the past, in contrast to old social risks, such as old age, invalidity, or cyclical unemployment. Social policy scholars identified a set of new social risks, such as obsolete skills, single parenthood, or the need to care for a frail parent or a frail partner. What you need foremost in that new context of new social risks, we said then, are education, training, activation, rather than cash unemployment benefits, child care rather than child benefits, elderly care, not only retirement pensions, social investment, services and investment in human capital rather than social insurance. Alongside this social investment focus came a continued emphasis on personal responsibilities. Policymakers worried about inactivity traps, where benefits might discourage the take-up of activation, might discourage work. And so they decided that it was useful to tighten conditionality. The welfare state was no longer seen purely as a cost factor, as a productive factor. In that social welfare state, benefit recipients were supported, even generously, but they should seek employment or retrain. The decreasing popularity of the insurance paradigm can also be explained, I think, by the simple fact that between the end of the 1980s and 2008, no major, large-scale economic shock hit Western Europe. The experience of surges in cyclical unemployment receded from our memory, while structural unemployment and structural lack of opportunity became center stage. And so the possible drawbacks of generous insurance systems were much higher on the agenda in the thinking and in the policy than their beneficial stabilizing effects. I'll skip a part of the story which you may read in the background paper, but 5 years ago, the COVID-19 pandemic drove home the benefits of robust social protection more powerfully than anyone could have predicted. The pandemic exposed risks that were clearly not the fault of individuals, of choices. It highlighted how essential collective insurance mechanisms are in a crisis. Inclusive welfare systems moved from being scrutinized critically to being recognized gratefully as indispensable shock absorbers. Countries with comprehensive social programs are better able to respond. It's much easier to tell people to stay home when they are maybe infected or when their workplace is shut down, if you have universal sick pay, unemployment benefits, or job retention schemes in place. And in 2020, governments across Europe, including my own, expanded income support overnight, expanded short-time working arrangements, protection for self-employed people, others not traditionally protected, with hardly a mention of moral hazard. Keeping people financially secure during lockdowns wasn't just about compassion. It helped control the virus's spread and prevented economic freefall. In short, the COVID-19 experience underscored the message that a degree of moral hazard is a small price to pay for a society that can protect its members and remain stable in the face of massive external shocks. And I think many people hope that this experience would permanently shift the policy narrative away from a rather punitive focus on individual blame and back towards appreciation of the benefits of solidarity. In reality, the change in mindset after the pandemic, I think, has been mixed. As the pandemic subsided, the old narratives reasserted themselves. In my own country, Belgium, the public debate refocused on individual responsibility, especially regarding those on long-term benefits. Politicians drew sharp contrasts between hard-working taxpayers and people living on benefits, with loud calls to responsibilize, as we say that in Belgium, to responsibilize the latter. Rather than expanding on the promise of solidarity seen during COVID, discussions returned to tightening benefit conditionality and reducing costs. Obviously, that is not happenstance. It's not only because bad people are influencing us. Many European welfare states now face immense fiscal pressure in the wake first of COVID, then measures taken to protect people in the energy crisis, and they have to invest in defense, there is no doubt about that. But they also have to invest in health and care. And simultaneously, we are confronted in many countries, certainly in Belgium, but I think also in the UK, with a social problem that is in a sense an old social risk. It's in the list of the old social risks, but one that manifests itself now in a new way and that shares many features with the new social risks, which we identified in the 90s. That is the social problem of a steadily growing caseload of people living on long-term incapacity benefits. That is as much a health and healthcare problem as it is a social and labor market problem. In short, we are confronted with tough choices. How to reinforce solidarity and address emerging needs in hard times. And that brings us back to the central question I promised to address. What exact conception of individual responsibility is most appropriate for today's welfare states, given these challenges? You cannot have welfare state solidarity without responsibility. I defended that thesis for many years. Intellectually, I was influenced by the responsibility-sensitive egalitarianism of John Rawls, by Jerry Cohen's criticism of Rawls and Cohen's luck egalitarianism, which you may understand as a specific, or I would say a rigorous strands of responsibility-sensitive egalitarianism, simply saying that disadvantage, which is the consequence of choice, of deliberate choice, is not an unjust disadvantage, period. But simultaneously, I never thought that luck egalitarianism yielded the one and only principle to be applied in the praxis of social policy. Now, in I think a very thought-provoking book published in 2017, Yascha Mounk questions the legacy of Rawls and challenges in particular the application of luck egalitarianism to social policy. He claims that luck egalitarianism simply asks the wrong question. And Mounk shows how, since the 1970s already, responsibility, which once meant a moral duty to help and support others, has come to be equated with an obligation to be self-sufficient. How it shifted from responsibility as duty to a narrow focus on responsibility as accountability. And this simply served to justify welfare state retrenchment. So you remember my quote of Cohen on Dworkin. Mounk does not write it in this way, but he might say, Cohen, rather than praising Dworkin for rendering a service to egalitarianism, he made a big mistake. And indeed, according to Mounk, left-wing thinkers such as Cohen made a fundamental error by tying equality too tightly to responsibility. And by asking the wrong question, they create an impasse. In order to keep defending redistribution and solidarity within a luck egalitarian framework, those left-wingers must develop arguments that minimize the actual responsibility of individuals. But minimizing people's own responsibility is implausible and contradicts what people themselves believe. Therefore, says Mounk, it's better to stop focusing on responsibility in this way. The responsibilities we attribute to people should flow from our vision of what a just society is, the values that play a role in such a society, such as no poverty, no oppression, equality of status. Those values are the starting point. Personal responsibility comes in only insofar as individual behavior must meet certain expectations in order to sustain such a just society. I think if you read the book, there's much to recommend in Monk's description of what social policy should do. Rather than punishing people for past choices, social policy should empower them to take responsibility for themselves and others in the future. It should help them to become self-reliant where possible, rather than punishing them for past decisions. And that resonates with the philosophy of activation developed, for instance, by Jean-Michel Bonvin, relying on Amartya Sen's capability framework. And I think that such a forward-looking capacity-building approach is particularly relevant when dealing with people living on long-term incapacity benefits, the political problem that exercises me right now. However, I think that does not set us free from the question of personal responsibility. If we care about solidarity and justice, we cannot avoid that question, however complicated it may be. What we must recognize is that the answer will rarely be black and white. In real life, social disadvantages usually result from a mixture of bad luck and deliberate decisions. That is a first complication. Another complication is that holding adults strictly accountable for their choices can end up harming people who had no choice at all, notably their children. If parents make bad decisions that lead to poverty, their children suffer the consequences through no fault of their own. You must not harm the children by withholding aid from the parents, even if that would be, as such, maybe legitimate. And most fundamentally, from an ethical point of view, attention to responsibility does not mean being ruthless towards human failings. Some consequences of individual choice, for which people are indeed responsible, some consequences can be so dramatic, the vulnerability that results so fundamental, that we still wish to repair or compensate. An emergency ward receiving 2 gravely injured patients does not ask who respected the traffic rules. That question may arise later, in relation to the financial settlement of the accident, but not in the immediate medical care. And the same, I think, is true in many other social policy contexts, where the question, how did you get in this situation, is not guiding the decision to help or not. Providing shelter to the homeless is an example. A policy of harm reduction for drug addicts by organizing a safe consumption environment whilst maintaining drug prohibition. I'm against legalization, but I'm for safe environments. There might be another example. This intuition is about compassion. Protecting the vulnerable, sometimes regardless of the reason for their vulnerability, is a task that the community must take up as a positive responsibility, as Robert Goodin has argued persuasively 40 years ago in a book which then also influenced me strongly. One might say that compassion is a compelling duty, also for a policymaker who values personal responsibility and agency highly. If someone's vulnerability is so existential that it threatens to wipe out his or her agency completely, there can be no responsibility without agency. Rescuing someone's agency is the first task to be accomplished. And therefore, as a policymaker, I've always argued that social policy walks on 2 legs, both compassion and personal responsibility. In fact, my argument used to be that compassion limits the role of personal responsibility, or even simply cancels the rule of responsibility. I think now that this may be not the way to understand the philosophical problem at hand. Serena Olzaretti has argued, I think convincingly, that it is not necessary to deny someone's responsibility or to limit the role of responsibility in our conception of justice if we want to avoid harsh conclusions. Even if we accept the importance of holding someone responsible for their choices, it's an open question what consequences those choices should have. In addition to a principle concerning the grounds of responsibility, we need a principle of stakes, as Olsaretti calls it, to make our judgments of responsibility determinate, rather than to justify placing limits on responsibility. The question of stakes is a question of what responsibility itself requires. When we defend the particle principle of stakes as superior to alternative ones, we are fleshing out, not constraining, the demands of responsibility. And in somewhat similar vein, Zofia Stemplovska argues that for responsibility for disadvantage to justify that disadvantage, which is the lucky dally that we take, the options faced by people must be deemed just by independent criteria. There must be a just opportunity structure within which people make responsible choices. So in other words, several values are at play, and such pluralism is inherent in philosophical reflection. Yes, a welfare state should encourage and even expect individuals to take responsibility where they can, but must also guarantee a floor of protection for all, regardless of how or why someone ended up in need. We need to decide as a matter of principle how much a person's behavior should affect the support and protection they receive. Returning to Yascha Mounk, I would say asking to what extent solidarity has to be mobilized if someone's misfortune or disadvantage is partly or wholly the result of deliberate choice. Asking that is not asking the wrong question. However, it's not the only normative question. And indeed, I think solidarity in a modern welfare state must be responsibly sensitive without becoming responsibility obsessed. You need to reconcile values. I think a pluralistic approach is inherent to any reasonable theory of social justice, including theories that emphasize responsibility. Now, shying away from personal responsibility, I think it's not only philosophically unpersuasive, it's also politically unwise. Public support for the welfare state often hinges on perceptions of fairness and reciprocity. People are far more willing to pay into a system that in their view does not reward idleness or bad behavior without consequence. Voters ask, are those who receive benefits doing their part to the extent that they are able? And that deservingness sentiment is a reality that advocates of solidarity must address. But crucially, we should address it consistently. That means holding not just the poor and the vulnerable to appropriate expectations, but also holding the rich and the powerful to their responsibilities. If we demand that an unemployed worker actively seek a job as a condition of support, we can likewise demand that a successful corporation or a wealthy individual pay their fair share in taxes to support the system. Responsibility is a two-way street. As citizens, we owe duties to one another, and those duties apply to everyone, not only to those at the bottom. In fact, appealing to a balanced and a comprehensive notion of responsibility strengthens the case for solidarity. Most people accept that someone who genuinely cannot work should be supported, especially if that person has tried to contribute in the past. And by the same token, people intuitively feel that those who have benefited most from the society, the winners, so to speak, should contribute back in proportion. If ordinary, hardworking people are expected to play by the rules and put in effort, they'll also expect wealthy elites to pay what is due and not game the system. A discourse about responsibility that includes both rich and poor can unite the public around a sense of shared fairness. We all give, we all take, according to our abilities and needs. So far, I've argued that solidarity implies responsibility in two senses. The first is mutual responsibility, and the most mundane demand of mutual responsibility is that we pay taxes and social security contributions to compensate the victims of misfortune. And the second is personal accountability for the beneficiary of that compensation. Disadvantage, I think, is inevitably a responsibility-sensitive concept. But in addition, there is a third sense in which solidarity needs responsibility. to help people on long-term incapacity benefits rejoin the world of work if they still have that potential. It's not enough to expect the individuals alone to try harder. Yes, they should. But physicians must provide proper care and honest assessments. Employers should offer adapted work or retraining opportunities. Public services need to support rehabilitation and job placement. If these actors shirk their part, an individual's personal responsibility can achieve little. Only when all parties do their part can the fabric of solidarity remain strong and effective. There is a shared obligation, a co-responsibility of many actors and institutions to make solidarity work in practice. And using Zofia Stemplovska's formula, I would say that the co-responsibility for creating and maintaining a just opportunity structure is a critical premise for true welfare state solidarity. And that brings me finally to a fourth notion of responsibility, the responsibility of the politician to sustain solidarity. I can tell you that this often requires difficult compromises. Sometimes one must accept a policy that is far less than ideal in order to safeguard a greater system of social support, choosing a lesser evil over allowing opponents of the welfare state to dismantle it entirely. It means fighting, also in the public debate, for a correct and proportionate conception of responsibility that demands as much in terms of duty from wealthy citizens who don't need social programs, as it demands in terms of accountability from the often relatively poor beneficiaries of such programs. It also means that one should not shy away from difficult debates about co-responsibility for the precious good of solidarity. Difficult debates since it involves a very wide range of actors and also an ethos of daily conduct. At the very end of my doctoral dissertation in 1999, which I wrote physically a few hundred meters from here, I wrote, and I hope you find it arrogant that I quote it, but I wrote, "So, invoking responsibility must signal simultaneously two normative ideas: personal accountability for personal choice and a sense of social commitment. The egalitarian perspective that is the essence of social democracy requires both. This twofold ethos has to shape our society's institutions and the way agents behave within those institutions. It calls upon the talented and the powerful as much as it calls on the poor and the powerless." All this remains an uphill battle, more than ever today, but the difficulty of the task does not release us from it. Thank you. Thank you.